Hi again, it's Nick Mays, and this is the fourth lecture in our series, Modernity, a Survival Guide. In our first three lectures, we considered our foundations, the definitions of history and modernity. We saw that there has truly been change, and we saw that we can judge the past on occasion to very positive effect. In this fourth lecture, I would like to consider the many losses we have sustained and how these losses have affected the cornerstone of our identity. All right, today let's talk about loss. There have been approximately 119 billion humans ever born, and we, 8 billion, are walking on the remains of about 111 billion, with the idea in mind, of course, that future generations will walk on our bones. This is all rather gloomy, but it is very much part of our history. And what are we to make of this loss? Well, one way of looking at it is a question that I ask my students at the start of each year when I was teaching a modern Western history course. I asked them, when we think of ourselves traveling through time, and I mean this mainly with respect to the West, but you could speak of any population, I imagine. When we think of ourselves traveling through time, are we more camper trailers or are we more Saturn V's? It's a bizarre question, but they quickly get what I'm trying to explain to them when I go into further detail. So a camper trailer, for example, it drives over long distances, as you can see in this map here. And every night, after covering 3 or 4 or 500 miles, it stops off in a campsite, and the passengers unload their stuff, and they have all the comforts of home. They can make a bonfire, they can sit in their favorite chair, they can sleep in a comfortable bed with clean sheets and all their favorite clothes and books and knickknacks around them. So is this what it's like when we travel through time as Westerners or as human beings? As we travel through time, moving from one stage to the next, one period to the next, are we carrying with us all our classical texts, all this classical wisdom? These are Greek and Roman texts published by the Loeb Classical Library. Is this what we've done, traveling constantly with such wisdom in tow? Or with all of our art in tow? Van Gogh's Starry Night and Michelangelo's David and Andy Warhol's Marilyn and Albert Durer's portrait of a rabbit and so on and so forth, the millions and millions of pieces of art that have been produced by these very, very skilled artisans. Do we carry them from one age to the next, as well as our musical legacy, the works of Bach and Beethoven and Haydn and the Fab Four and Marley and so on and so forth? And our relics, our holy relics and our rites and our texts and our habits and our fashions, everything. Is this what we do as we travel through time, hanging on to as much as we possibly can as we go from one period to the next, so we'll have all this familiar stuff around us? Or are we Saturn V's? Why Saturn V? Well, you'll recall that when Neil Armstrong and his crew were traveling to the moon, as they were shooting up into the atmosphere, they would lose successive stages of their rocket. And if Neil Armstrong had been looking in the rearview mirror and watching these pieces drop to the ground and had been groaning, oh my goodness, what a beautiful, beautiful piece of equipment, and it's all falling to pieces, someone working at Mission Control would have told him, look, Neil, you have to lose this stuff if you're going to get to the moon. You have to drop this stuff off if you're going to go further and further. Is that is that what our passage through time has been like? Notably in the West, because the change has been so extraordinary. In order to move forward, do we have to lose baggage, very, very precious baggage? And the answer to that, in a word, is yes. Right? Our movement forward entails losses. And what losses they have been. If you were to wonder how many languages of human beings spoken, right now we're talking about humans a passage through time, overall, we've lost hundreds of languages, thousands of habits, thousands of little religious practices, thousands of habits and identities and so on and so forth. To move through time means we have things stripped away from us. Sometimes we try to hold things still, as King Darius I of Persia tried to hold things still. Here we see his description at Behistun, carved into a mountainside, no less, so that it will last forever, in 3 languages, so that anyone walking by will know what he was like. You can read his biography here, if you can read Elamite or Old Persian or Babylonian. The fact of the matter is that 0.000000001% of the population now can read just one of these languages. And they don't care about Darius if they actually come into this corner of Iran to see this story that this ancient king tells of himself that he was hoping would last forever, but it hasn't come anywhere close to that. All lost, slipping through his fingers. The same is true when Shelley writes his famous poem, based on his memorable trip to Egypt. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away. Ramses II, the most powerful pharaoh, perhaps, of all the pharaohs who ever lived over a period of time of several thousand years. And what's left of this man, and what's left of ancient Egypt? 2 legs and a head on the ground. You can just imagine a tourist coming by and taking pictures of this person, not knowing who it is, and then he gets back onto the air-conditioned bus and drinks down his soda. That's what it's all been reduced to. Loss, loss, loss. Now, loss entails victims, and there are 3 categories of victims I would like to look at. 2 very briefly, and the third in much greater depth. And I'm now talking about Western victims of violence. And that is a bit artificial, because, as this famous scene from 2001 shows us, we have this violence programmed into us. All populations have been despicable in one capacity or the next. We are always preying upon our neighbor as a way of moving our own prospects forward. But because we're talking about the West, let's just discuss the victims of the West, the first 2 categories quickly, and the third one in greater depth. So the first category of victims, they come very readily to mind. There are the indigenous populations that inhabited North and South America until the Europeans' arrival on the scene, at which point they started dying in very, very large numbers, some through microbial infection, many through violence and machinations and schemings. Very, very sad history. And then, of course, there are the 12 million Africans, at least, who were sent over to North America as slaves, and South America as slaves, as well as the millions who were brutalized through the operations of Western imperialism, right? Unquestionably victims. One can't hide this under the carpet. One has to give this ugly chapter its full dues. There's a second category of victims as well. These are homegrown victims. These are victims who were back in the old country. They were the victims of war and the victims of persecution, religious persecution. Think of all the Jews who passed before the Inquisition, or who died in pogroms, or various lower class members who existed or operated at the whim of their overlords, or what happened to populations when you suddenly had a change of boundaries, or a new lord was walking the scene, or what happened to these innocent people who were just trying to get on with their lives when religious reforms broke out and caused wars of one stripe or another. You had these people who were caught in the middle and who led desperate lives because of it. When we talk about war, does anyone remember the War of the Spanish Succession? Right? This was fought for a period of some 12 to 13 years, and it was fought between 2 upper-class twits, Philip and Charles, and the bone of contention was who should sit on the Spanish throne, and it came at a mild cost of 1.2 million European lives, all to determine this rather trivial issue. Right? These are genuine victims of Western violence as well. They are part of this legacy of loss. And of course, we can think of the many, many victims of Nazism, or the many, many, many people, the many eggs that got cracked, with a view to making the perfect communist omelet. These too are victims of the West, homegrown victims of the West. Then there's a third category of victim, and perhaps victim isn't the right word to use. These are people who saw their entire world overturned. They weren't tortured necessarily. They weren't put to death, but they saw everything that they had invested meaning into change before their eyes. Um, the chapter in Western history that I'm really thinking of, although one could apply it to earlier periods too, is the Industrial Revolution. With the onset of Industrial Revolution and the creation of factories, we had to move from rural regions into urban life. And what an overturning of experience that was for the people who actually encountered it. No longer were they working according to the seasons, rising with the cock's crow or the sun and going to sleep, or ending the day's work when the sun went down, or working with the seasons, hard in the spring and the summer and the fall, but not so hard in the winter, with all their festivals that dated back centuries and centuries, and this close, intimate life with livestock, right? All of that was overturned very, very quickly. Instead of knowing where you came from, looking at that church plot where your ancestors were buried and where everyone knew you, all your neighbors knew you, you were now in a new context where the person calling the shots wasn't the local lord, but now it was the factory boss, getting you to work in a system that was unrelenting because you had artificial lighting, so there was no end to the natural working day, in city circumstances that were squalid, that had none of the appeal of the former home, alienated from people, no longer attending your family church, right? A true transformation of everything that you took to be foundational to your own existence. People didn't like it, of course. You had Luddites, skilled craftsmen who tried to smash the early mechanical looms as a way of somehow making time stand still, but it was futile. These people, like everyone else, would end up working at these new processes. And right, I mean, at this point in time, it's all based on profit. So if young children can turn a profit for the factory boss, well, why not? This is before we actually have certain labor laws come in, marking children off from this ghastly regimen of unregulated work. This beautiful painting by Turner shows the shifting of attitudes. We have the sailing ship Temeraire, right, so noble in its passage through the seas, now being towed by a steamship, to some body of water where it will be scuppered, where it will be sunk because it has served its purpose. And the new age of mechanical sailing is going to replace this old age of elegance, of canvas and everything that went into this old-fashioned means of discovering the world. A true move from the old, from the old into the new. Over time, we adjusted. We got used to urban life, and the squalor of the early cities was now eliminated through massive engineering projects and such public entertainment houses as museums and theaters and music halls, together with public education. The law caught up to this change, but that doesn't alter the fact that a generation or several generations that moved from the countryside into the city lost huge treasures, even as they gained new ones. And this is what I mean by this third set of victims. In other words, when we really think of progress and we compare it to this flight of a Saturn V, and we speak of loss, to some degree, our advancement is a large crime scene. There's always some type of victim left behind in the dust, right? It seems overly dramatic because, of course, this type of victim isn't nearly as egregious as the type of victim that we saw, in the first category, the African American who was brutally treated, or the indigenous who were slaughtered, very often to a man. To be sure, this type of victim is different, but it still involves loss on a lesser scale, but it is loss nonetheless. Perhaps you don't think that's true, and yet think of that Dutchman I spoke of in our first lecture, and his sadness, just this overwhelming sadness when he thought of that young Muslim woman whom he had been in touch with, whom he'd had such a meaningful exchange with, and how rooted he thought she was, and how authentic he thought she was. And then his prediction that within a certain period of time, her village would be visited with a McDonald's, and that rootedness and authenticity would disappear. Right? I understand exactly what he was getting at. Everyone in that hut understood, and no doubt you understand that too. We see someone like this, and we dread, in some ways, what effect McDonald's is going to have on our culture. But how is that different from this scene here? Here we see a church in my hometown of Toronto. At one time, it just received huge numbers of congregants on a Sunday. And what is it today? It's turned into a set of condos. There's no one there. This structure that people went to be comforted and consoled and to celebrate, right, the majesty of the divine and so on and so forth. And now it's a place you go to read your email and to sleep at night, right? And that change involves a certain degree of loss that we have to do full justice to if we're going to understand the price of modernity and at the same time the profits that come about. Again, if we're looking at Kyrgyzstan again, imagine the gentleman on the left driving this wagon of his transporting goods. And then you've got a transport truck that comes in and it replaces him. And he's thinking, how can that be? How can my efforts be overturned so quickly with this mechanical device? How is that different from a logger who is used to driving his truck through the wilds of BC and Oregon? And he suddenly discovers he's out of a job because we can now get that done by a logging truck of this nature, self-driving, right? He is just being given his marching orders. You may as well keep moving because your days as a transport driver, they're finished. Right? So let's just continue with this theme of work in the West. Overnight, pretty much overnight in so many different Western cities, individuals who had invested in taxi medallions, which here in Toronto cost a fortune, hundreds of thousands of dollars, they suddenly discovered that their monopoly on driving taxis about and transporting people had been replaced by Uber, right? This was such a shift. But before the Uber driver, right, really gets too full of himself, already we see remnant, we see the sprouts of a system that will replace the Uber driver with driverless taxis, right? We've got Waymo, which isn't a perfect system, but it does operate in San Francisco and Phoenix. And you can get into this car and you can actually be taken from point A to point B without anyone at the wheel, right? And that's in 2024. What will things be like in 2050 when this technology becomes so much sharper, right? Anyone who's driving a car today, and that means lots and lots of people, they will be out of a job. Or I'm sure this has happened to you. You go to your neighborhood grocery store and you greet the cashier and you know her first name because you've been there so often and you have a chat with each other. And then one day you discover that she's been replaced by something that's automatic. This has happened again and again and again. Or when I was growing up, the bank teller was someone you would inevitably see when you had money to deposit or money to withdraw. And now, of course, it's been replaced by an ATM. This has been going on for years. Or the librarian, right? Not so long ago, the librarian had multiple jobs of checking out books. Now, perhaps you don't check out books at all because you just take them out online. Or if you do take the physical book out, you don't have to depend upon the talents of this lady here to actually put it in your hands. You can just do it through the use of a machine. Right? When I go to my local library, there is this lament. We used to be 20 or 30 people working here. Now there are only 5 of us. And of course, if you're working in a factory, and how many people work in factories, lifting objects and placing them in a certain area, right? Already huge parts of this job have been taken over by machines, and one can only imagine that this is going to become more and more of a practice. Right? What is the greatest employment of men right now? Transportation. What happens when you have driverless trucks and suddenly you have hundreds of thousands of men who are put out of work? Or construction, which is now being done partly by drone, right? We see that the nature of work and the purpose it gives us, the meaning it has to us, is being displaced. Right? There are going to be many, many victims of this change as we move into the future. Think of the tenets of our identity. Who are we? Who are we? What does it mean to be a man? I mean, if you'd asked this of my grandfather, who actually fought for a lengthy period of time, in World War I, he would have said, well, a man is someone who stares down his fears and he's there for his family. And he would come up with another series of, a list of qualities that a real man would fulfill. Is that true today? Is that true today if you're never faced with the prospect of manning up, of going to war? If if your wife actually earns more than you do, if you decide not to have children, or perhaps you're working at a job that's so complicated and so well paying that you get someone else to rear the children for you, what would you know of that traditional type of manliness that an earlier member of your family would look upon as being so essential to what it was to be a man? Right? At the same time, family and children. What if you don't want to have a family? At one time, it was just understood. Well, that's what you're going to do. If you're a citizen with a pulse, you'll get married and you'll have children. And if you don't, it's a tragedy. There's something wrong here. And nowadays, we have very significant numbers of people who are completely opting out of getting married and having children. Or if they do get married, very often they feel that children are not a necessary component of the equation. What about authority? Who has authority over us? Does the church have authority over us? Do we respect even the proper figures of our government in the way that earlier generations did? Most people don't regard the office of the presidency or the prime minister with the same degree of regard today as they did in the past. And the notion of a king who would have absolute control over us, that's utter nonsense. What about our canon of texts? These too gave us such a sense of purpose and direction, and more about them in just a few minutes. Right? I mean, the Bible had been read forever. Homer had been read forever. These were repositories of such wisdom that how couldn't you, even in the year 1960, 1970, or no, 2024, you can't do without it if you actually want to found a life for yourself. But in actual fact, maybe you can, right? Patriotism and country, the notion pro patria mori, dulce et decorum pro patria mori, that this old line from Horace, it is sweet and noble to die for your country. How many people would really think that? There are some, right? But because we're not really sure about the authority that stands over us, who are you to put me on the battlefield? And we're not really sure if we're dying for these eternal values of manliness and country and family and God and king and so on and so forth. Well, perhaps dying for one's country is not a terribly good idea, right? And I just mentioned him, God, that slippery entity. Does he exist? And if he does exist, how can I know that he wants me to do what you're telling me to do? How can I know these things? And if you don't have God and you don't have patriotism and you don't have these canons, what does community mean? Right? Do we live in communities any longer? Well, the idea is that the communities are quite a bit more eroded than they were in the past. Our sense of this, we're not tied to it in the way that our ancestors were. So these are significant changes. I mean, these are the big elements that define who we are, and all of them are up for grabs. And that involves a sense of very significant loss, especially in a day and age where there are very few separations. Right? One way of identifying yourself, unfortunately, is by saying, well, I know who I am because I'm not like that person over there. But we live in a day and age where the difference between black and white is nowhere near as pointed, thank goodness, as it was in times past. Or the difference between male and female. Right? What a male does, well, a female can probably do just as well. Right? Or countries. To be French at one time meant something, it truly meant something, as opposed to German. In fact, the two populations were willing to go to war over this. And now, generally speaking, the feeling is, yes, of course, there's still pride in being French and pride in being German, but the feeling on the part of the citizens in both countries is, well, we're both European. We're European. Those pointed differences have fallen aside to some degree. And the difference between Christian and Jew, we've got the Christian Brad Pitt over to one side, and we've got the Jew, the Jewish actor, over to another side. And you realize both of them are navigating the same territory with the same expectations and pretty much the same treatment, right? So how do you define yourself in a world like this, where your tenets are gone and the things that the elements that were different from you have now become so much more similar to yourself? How do you define yourself? And what are we to make of this loss of identity? Still, in spite of all of this, there was an assumption in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s, as modernity was plowing on and these tenets of identity were being worn more and more and more. There was this assumption that there is there is a solid point in our lives, that there is a rock of Gibraltar. In fact, there are two such points that we have and that will somehow keep us moving. First, there is the church, there's Christianity or faith as a whole. And second, there is the classical tradition. People had been Christian for so long, or people had been Jewish for so long, or Muslim for so long, that you could just assume that as we move into the future, there would be room for a meaningful expression of this element in our lives, that you could always tell yourself Western society would have the underpinnings of faith. And at the same time, we've been reading classical texts for so long that you could tell yourself these classics have accompanied us on a long, long journey, and more about that in a moment, right? So they will be with us too, even if we are in the world, living in the age of 2100 or 2200. When you take a look at the church, just to see how instrumental it has been to our identity, it lay at the very, very heart of all governance, right? If a family was going to tell you why it got to call the shots, be it a British monarchy or a French monarchy or a German monarchy, there would be some reference to God in that contract between you and them, because God was a way of them advertising to the world, we are legitimate rulers. So their governance was impregnated with references to the Christian faith. You couldn't open a parliament in England without one of these people up in the right-hand corner attending the opening ceremonies, right? As happens today, these are members of the Anglican Church who are giving their blessings upon this gathering of parliamentarians, even the atheists among them today, with the idea in mind that God, if he's still out there and still listening to us, is going to inspire these people who are going to govern in the name of others, right? We see behind me here, Christ Church, Oxford. Right? At one time, all of these higher institutions of learning started off as as extensions of the church. The church was very, very interested in seeing its future clergy members trained, or professions of one type or another trained under its auspices, doctors, theologians, lawyers, classicists, right? They were seeing to this education. And it was just understood that if you were going to get a higher education, if you went to the University of Padua or to the Sorbonne or to Oxford or to Cambridge, you were operating in a context that was very much controlled by the church and by Christian dogma. And of course, every single American president, when he swears an oath to protect the American Constitution, he does so on a Bible. In fact, talking of the United States, it's so interesting to see one proposed design for its Great Seal. Benjamin Franklin thought that the Great Seal of the United States should bear the image of the Israelites under Moses crossing the Red Sea and Pharaoh being drowned at the hands of the pillar of fire, God who was overseeing this new population. Of course, there was this enormous connection being drawn between the Israelites of old and these Americans who were off in this new land and venturing on this new experiment of democratic living in a republic. But fascinating that this religious image was invoked to give this whole enterprise a certain majesty and heft, right from the beginning. And then, of course, when one thinks of the wars that were fought in the name of Christianity, the Crusades and the Reformation, and the time of Joan Arc, the 100 Years' War, and so on and so forth, we realize that this is a serious motivating factor in European life. In fact, what was music at one time? Music was composed for the church. So much of Bach is sacral music. Right? And so much of art is sacral art, the Pieta. I mean, what were you going to draw? What were you going to sculpt? What were you going to paint? You were going to paint lives of the saints, or the sufferings of Jesus, or a picture of him on the Temple Mount, and so on and so forth. You would refer to something important and substantial in your work, and that would inevitably be something of Christian merit. The same could be true of so much of our literature. You have Milton's Paradise Lost or Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. The latter is particularly interesting because this was literature for children in the early 19th century. It was a very mournful tale of what happens if You don't behave in an exemplary Christian spirit, and what happens if you do? Right? It was subsequently replaced by Lewis Carroll, which was just a leap forward, Alice in Wonderland, that is, as far as imagination was concerned, because for once you had children's literature that was not didactic, Christian in a Christian fashion. Instead, it was just utter nonsense, sheer entertainment, but how different that was from an earlier way of doing things. In other words, when we look at Christianity, we see that it just imbued every element of Western society at one time, except in the 19th century, right, at the time of industrialization, and even earlier, we had mortal blows given to it. One blow was the Enlightenment, right, where we had these brilliant thinkers like Voltaire or Montesquieu or Diderot, you know, arguing how the the game plan of Catholicism was no longer really doable in a burgeoning modern world. Voltaire would famously end his letters, écraser l'infâme, destroy the infamy, get rid of the church, no longer let it sit as this blob on the landscape, blocking all progress and every facet of our human expression. Even as you had these Enlightenment thinkers laying the foundations for a new way of looking at the world, you also had critical, biblical criticism come along. You suddenly had these critics who were looking at the Bible not as the Word of God, or possibly as the Word of God, possibly, but there were elements in it that were not the Word of God. And they felt that by applying modern literary techniques to the text, they could separate the different voices in the Bible and determine what was true and what was false. Right? And that too suddenly introduced to a population this notion that perhaps this text was like any other human generated. And then, of course, we had Darwin and his brilliant observations and his brilliant theory of natural selection, which once again, right, pushed to one side this notion of our own divine origins and replaced it with something much more mundane, but in some ways just as admirable. Hence the Pew Report of 2019. All of this has been dogging us for the longest time. The instrumentality of Christian thought for our development, but then these body blows delivered to it, and now it's caught up with us. So in 2019, the people of Pew did a survey, and they reported that there were two-thirds of Americans in 2019 described themselves as Christians. That was down 10% from their poll of some 10 years back. And if you were to do that poll today, no doubt that number would be significantly smaller. Of that population that still called themselves Christian, right, some 84% were above the age of 65, right? And now these people are what, 70 and more. And boomers, 75% of them were boomers, but of millennials, less than half of them consider themselves to be Christian. And they're the ones who are going to carry this tradition forward if it is to be carried forward. At the same time, only half of the population said that religion was important to them, and a third were actually attending church on a weekly basis, as opposed to 10% that were doing it on a monthly basis, and 45% that didn't go at all, that had no interest in this text, no interest in these rituals, no interest in this tradition. They had cast it out of their Saturn V. And the same was true of Canada and Europe. We don't have to go through the details so painstakingly, but from having had half the population Catholic, Canada in 2019 had a mere third of Canadians who called themselves Catholic, and these people, once again, tended to be above the age of 65. Of Anglicans, it had fallen over a period of 15 years, from something like 17% to a mere 4%. 20% of people attended church on a regular basis, right? Only 27% would say that religion was crucial, and the majority, they had no interest in this whatsoever. And Europe was even more threadbare. As you can see, in Norway, 7% of the population would attend church. In England, 8%, France, 12%, and Germany, 10%. The really shocking outlier here is the United States in some ways, because the United States and Americans as a whole had always thought of themselves as being conscientiously more religious than anyone else. But modernity has caught up with them, and they too are throwing this baggage out of their Saturn V. So that as you travel North America and as you travel Europe, you come across infrastructures like this, vast, vast churches or monasteries or nunneries that have just been boarded up because there's nothing to do with these landmarks, unless you're going to convert them into condominiums, or if you go to my hometown of Montreal, some very, very significant nunneries have been turned into colleges. Why not? Right? If you go to the Czech Republic, you'll see the same thing. Buildings have been converted into jails or into schools or into hotels or into houses, unless they've just been completely abandoned. There are loads of these buildings, but there simply isn't enough supply to keep them full. That's Christianity. Christianity seems to be really losing a lot of steam. But the same could be said of Judaism, as this chart that came out some 20 years ago pointed out so aptly. In this chart, you see 5 columns. The one on the leftmost one would be secular Jews. Beside it would be liberal or Reform Jews. Beside that, conservative Jews. And then you would have modern Orthodox and Orthodox, so that you go up the level of, no, you go up the scale of commitment in some way. And what this study was proposing was that if you started off with 100 of each category of Jew right now, and you followed their prospects over a period of 4 generations, what would you have 4 generations later based on assimilation rates and the number of children that each of these different categories of Jew is having? Well, you're right. Ultimately, if you start off with 100 secular Jews, you would end up with something like 7 at the end of it. If you started off with 100 Reform Jews, you would end up with approximately 10%, right? Or sorry, 21, some 10% of them. If you started with conservative Jews, you would end up with 29, as opposed to modern Orthodox and very, very Orthodox Jews, where the numbers just explode. In the case of the modern Orthodox, you're now looking at an explosion of 300%. And in the case of the ultra Orthodox, you're looking at an explosion of some 4,000%. Just extraordinary growth, right? But still, Judaism ultimately is dying, because the last 2 categories, the modern Orthodox and the Orthodox, they depend so significantly on the secular, the Reform, and the conservative to carry them through, to offer them financial support and political harbor. And therefore, when we speak of the death of these first 3 categories, who represent some 85 to 90% of Jews living today, we see that Judaism too is losing steam, that this faith that this population placed in Torah and their notion of God is gradually coming to a halt. Same could be said of Islam in the West, right? When you look at the West, right, there are 2 sources of growth for Muslims in the West. They can either be migrating to the West, or they have children. What's interesting is that the first generation of Muslims who arrive in the West, they have fairly high fertility rates, a TFR perhaps of 3, that is a total fertility rate of 3. So couples are giving rise to 3 children each. But very quickly, the next generation that experiences all the assets of modernity, education and the like, their fertility rate immediately drops to what it is among the host population, below replacement level, below 2.2. And so the projection for Europe is that there will be a burgeoning Muslim population, right? From 3.8% in the EU today, there'll probably be a 7% Muslim population in 2050, perhaps 8%. But overall, the TFR is going to shrink to 2%, and this population as well is going to become less and less enthusiastic. As far as their devotion is concerned, in the United States, some 40% of Muslims attend mosque on a regular basis, but some 32% seem to be as indifferent to the religion as Christians, secular Christians and Jews are as indifferent to their religions. And this probably reflects attitudes in Europe as a whole. And will that number grow of the disaffected? If Judaism and Christianity have taught us anything, they would seem to suggest that yes, that will very much be the case. So in other words, it isn't a total stretch to say that a faith-bound existence, notably Christianity, because we are talking about the West, is very much on the decline. This foundation, which was presumed to last forever, because it had lasted forever through all the changes from medieval times to the Renaissance to the Reformation, through the Enlightenment, through the early stages of industrialization, on to the age of imperialism, and so on and so forth. It had lasted through all these different changes, so why wouldn't it last straight on through to modern times? But it seems to have run out of steam once again. We seem to have cast that baggage out of our Saturn V's. And you could make the argument, who cares? Certainly a Richard Dawkins might speak that way, or undoubtedly a Christopher Hitchens would in his book, God is Not Great. Religion poisons everything. Right? And when one thinks of the Catholic Church and the way in which it cozied up to fascism, not just in Germany, but in Italy and over in South America, oh yeah, maybe it has this coming. Or when one thinks of the Catholic Church and the way in which it stood opposed to Galileo and all innovation that followed after that. They have always protested when new innovations have come about. They do not celebrate evolution. They don't celebrate stem cell research and so on and so forth. Yeah, maybe they have it coming. And then, of course, when one thinks of the blood libels launched against the Jews, courtesy of the Catholic Church, and the deep anti-Semitism that the Catholic Church has given voice to into fairly modern times, that too is deeply problematic. So why not take the garbage to the curb? Or the way it stood in the path of gay rights and women's rights, right, and abortion rights, and so on and so forth. Maybe, really, why would we lament the death of this faith and other faiths that really enjoin the same prescriptions upon us? Right? Protestantism and Judaism would have taken an equally negative stance with respect to gay rights. I'm talking about classical Protestantism and classical Judaism, classical Islam. Right? They too would have opposed gay rights and abortion. We still see that is the case with the more conservative elements within Islam. And then, of course, you've got ISIS and terrorist attacks and jihad and other terrible things taking place in the name of religion. Not just that, of course, there are acts of humility and kindness and generosity. But when you look at the legacy of religion and you look at the negative part of the ledger, a lot of people would say, who cares? So the West is no longer faith-bound. We've thrown that baggage out of our Saturn V. What difference does it make? But even very, very bright philosophers like Thomas Nagel and Jürgen Habermas, who are self-proclaimed atheists, they feel we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, that we haven't really, that in relying upon our rationalism, we haven't really a means to celebrate or describe what it is to be human. We can control the natural world, but what do we do when we're going to celebrate a marriage or we're going to bury someone in a dignified fashion? How do we, in a sense, parcel what it means to be human in a purely secular or perhaps a purely scientific manner, purely rational manner? Both these philosophers have pointed out these shortcomings. Or Douglas Murray, in his book, The Strange Death of Europe, he quite right talks about the passing of the European identity, how it's just being pushed to one side. The story itself is being forgotten, right? And yet, Douglas Murray himself is gay and doesn't have children. And therefore, even as he says, Europe has lost its way because Europeans aren't having children and it's forgotten its religious past. It's a past that has set Douglas Murray free to express himself in some vein. This is notably a simplification of his arguments. And I'm not saying that he's in any way wrong. I'm just saying that you can see already it's a trade-off. You lose something deeply significant, but you gain something in the process. Another way of looking at the loss of religion is to consider Northrop Frye's book, The Great Code, in which this scholar is pretty much arguing if you want to understand our traditional literature, a Shakespeare or Christopher Marlowe, you will have to understand the Bible. It would be impossible to understand what these artists are talking about without a command of Scripture, because Scripture is so imbued in their souls. When they described the world, they did so through this religious filter. Can America be America if it's not one nation under God? Right? Well, I mean, this marked its birth. Can we speak of an America that generations down the road could identify with its precursor, its earlier versions, if this notion, this catchphrase, were somehow pushed under the carpet or just made nonsense of? At the same time, with the death of religion, we've also seen the hollowing out of our communal life, especially in small towns. Without a church where that everyone could visit and that provide communal services, not just spiritual ones, but such things as feeding the community or charity drives of one type or another, we've seen small town America somehow blow apart. People can't talk to each other in the same way. They don't have the same social glue holding them together. But what is one to do? Right? We threw this out of a craft, not because a gun was being held to our heads, but because we reached a point in the road. We realized we could move to the right and we could continue to advance higher and higher and higher, but we would have to dispense with this faith, or we could go to the left and we could continue with the faith, but we would have to stick with exactly the same material circumstances and lack of freedom that religion had imposed upon us. And without really thinking long and hard on it in some ways, we opted for the material gains and the gains to our personal freedom, always thinking that the spiritual meaning that the church had provided us with would somehow look after itself, little realizing that when we threw this baggage out of the craft, perhaps it took all of these different concomitant effects with it. What about classics? That too was foundational to our experience. And once again, what we're looking at here is the Loeb Classical Library, a collection of the writings of Caesar and Thucydides and Plato and Xenophon and all these other treasure troves of wisdom and information from the past. What what this classical tradition was with us right from the get-go of our modern, no, of our Western identity. First, why don't we just look at poetry? Poetry is a Greek word, poesis. What about philosophy? Well, surprisingly, it's a Greek word as well, philosophia. What about democracy and politics? Both of them are Greek words because these words, this idea of democracy and studying politics seriously, that started with the Greeks. What about entertainment? Drama, theater, comedy, tragedy, protagonist, episode. All of these are Greek words too, because this idea of theater as a formal, public type of entertainment, right? It started with the Greeks as well. History, Greek word, right? This idea of studying the past in a systematic fashion, that too is Greek. Mathematics, they too gave us this word, right? Think of Euclid's geometry or Archimedes and his discovery probably of the integral calculus, right? Athlete, gymnastics, Olympics, all Greek words because this was a population that celebrated in a very formal way physical prowess in the context of a formal festival, right? All these contributions the Greeks gave us, but there's more. The classics were with us when we left our distinctly medieval habits behind and we embraced a much more humanistic way of looking at the world. The classics inspired this perspective. Similarly, when Luther posted his 95 Theses and created this extraordinary religious revolution, he was inspired by classics and the philological habits that this gave him, the analytical habits that this occasioned. When Newton had the apple fall on his head at the time of the Enlightenment, this idea of puzzling the world out in a highly systematic fashion, whether it was science or politics or the economy, that too is an idea that the classical tradition had given rise to. And when the American Revolution was born, right, a pluribus unum and other such catchphrases, these were garnered from the classics, from the Greek texts and the Roman texts, because it was felt if you did want to build a democracy and you did want to build a republic, well, why not at least look at the only other past expedients as a role model? And where else would you find them except in classical literature? And the same was true of the French Revolution. When the heads started to roll, that was because the Greeks and the Romans somehow pointed the French in this new experimental direction. As was true of the Belle Epoque, even as modernity was truly setting its roots into the foundation, the feeling was now that we've gained a sufficient mastery of nature and we can live in large numbers comfortably in an urban setting, the meaning in our lives is going to come from the Christian church, of course, but it's also going to come from the writings of Plato, Xenophon, and others, right? The problem is that the store is closed. Right? This long, long legacy of classics, which people even in the 40s and 50s and 60s thought, as modernity was gathering steam, right? Which they thought would continue to inspire, because if they lasted through the American Revolution and the French Revolution and the Belle Epoque and the Industrial Revolution and so on and so forth, why shouldn't they last through this brave new age that we have now entered? Well, they were wrong. It isn't lasting any longer. These classics brought us to a certain altitude, and now we have to throw them from, we have to cast them off if we wish to rise higher. But how instrumental really were they? Well, Sigmund Freud, did he know the classics? Absolutely. Did John Locke know the classics? Absolutely. Did Marx know the classics? He knew the classics, the founder of communism? Yes. He wrote his masters on Lucretius and atomism, that is to say, a purely material explanation for the universe. It inspired him. This author from the first century CE inspires him. And Nietzsche, right, professor of Greek, right, God is dead. Well, he's coming up with that conclusion in part because of his own classical instruction. But the erosion, as I said, right, the erosion is significant. The store is closed. Right? In the 1930s, 1 million US students were studying Latin. In 1962, you had 700,000 of them still studying Latin, right? What killed it at that time, interestingly enough, was Sputnik. When the Soviets placed Sputnik into orbit, the Americans felt we're falling behind and our brightest minds should study something relevant like physics, chemistry, and math, and not enriched Latin. And so there was a gradual shift made for the best of reasons. And from that day, right, Latin has been spiraling ever downward, as has Greek in the classical tradition as a whole. In 1976, 150,000 students, right, where it's held generally steady. But very, very few people are going on to study classics to really lock it in place on the university level. In 1994, this is 30 years ago, of the million BAs that were issued in the United States, 600 of them were in classical studies. And one can only imagine that the number has dwindled even further. Even if you wanted to resurrect Greek and Latin, who would be able to teach it these days, or 20 years from now, when the erosion really hits rock bottom? If you go to Princeton, which was a bastion of classical studies at one time, or Oxford for that matter, you can study classics in translation. You can get a degree in classics without studying the original. That is how far this discipline has fallen. Right? In 1980, when you take a look at the 25 most popular texts that American university students were reading, 6 of them were from the classics, something like Plato's Republic and maybe Sophocles' Antigone. Today it is a mere 2. And one wonders, what will it be like 50 years from now? 0, perhaps. Who cares once again? Well, maybe it really doesn't matter, but as Victor Davis Hanson argued in Who Killed Homer, and as Alan Bloom argued in The Closing of the American Mind, if you want to understand our evolution, if you want to understand who we are, what our foundations are laid upon, you would have to understand this particular, superstructure, if you really, truly, or infrastructure, if you really, truly wanted to understand how far we've come, if you wanted to. Right? It imbues everything, just as the Bible accounts for so much of our art, so classics accounts for so much of our art and so much of our secular thought. But the store is closed, right? It carried us a very, very good height. And then it just became superfluous and we had to throw it off. We cast it off so we could go higher. Except at times we feel, as we do with the death of Christianity, that we're moving in circles. Yes, we have our smartphones and we've got this technology and we have all these spiffy practices around us, greater personal freedoms and whatnot. But why is it that we feel so at odds nonetheless? Right? And what's true of classics and Christianity perhaps is true of a later canon. One could argue, well, look, what difference does it make if you lose the classics? Because you can always make up for it with something new. Right? I mean, for example, think of, if you're an American, you don't have to read, right, Homer in order to feel rooted and authentic. You could read Huck Finn. Or if you're English, you could read a Shakespeare play, or A Tale of Two Cities, that's Sidney Carton in the upper left corner, or Pride and Prejudice, that cartoon version of it down in the lower left corner, or Robin Hood. That would tell you something about what it is to be British. That would give you a sense of meaning. Or you could, I mentioned Charles Lutwidge Dodson, there's Alice in Wonderland. If you wanted to understand something today of what it is to be British, you could read this canon, and you don't really have to turn to the church or to the classical record as a way of feeling somehow authenticated. The only problem is that how many people read these things? Think of movies like To Kill a Mockingbird or The Wizard of Oz. If you wanted to ask, what is it to be American? Well, in the 1950s or 60s, someone might have said, this is what it is to be an American. To be an American manly male is to be like Gregory Peck in To Kill a Mockingbird, where you stand up for what is right. And when you have to discipline your children, you do so in a loving and responsible fashion. So many men of the day saw this representation of manliness on the stage, on the screen, and they thought, that's the type of father and public figure I would like to be. Or when they watched The Wizard of Oz and they saw this young girl from Kansas standing up to all the whores at large in the world, right? Able to confront her fears when confronting this wicked witch of the West, with such American can-do spirit and candor and decency. That told you something about what it was to be an American. Or if you wanted just to celebrate, right, the marvels of being alive, Gene Kelly and Singing in the Rain. Or again, fighting for justice, Henry Fonda in 12 Angry Men. These were models of behavior in the same way that Huck Finn was a model of American behavior, or Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice was a symbol for romantic love at one time. Or Sidney Carton from A Tale of Two Cities was an example of true British pluck. These were canonical, and really, once again, who cares if you have Homer on hand or the church on hand if you've got these substitutes that can steer you and tell you what your identity is like? The only problem is no one reads these things. No one watches these things, not to nearly the same degree as they did before. These are no longer canonical. They are items that have been archived, and we can access them if we want and look at them briefly, but they don't imbue us with a sense of communal identity as they did in the past. The old foundational canon is gone, the church and classics, but the later canon that came to replace it, the works of a Dickens or a Shakespeare or a Jane Eyre or a Charlotte Bronte and so on and so forth, these two have fallen by the wayside. It's an interesting question. How do you continue with the canon? How do you reinforce it? I remember talking to my students a couple of years ago and mentioning Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, and they'd never heard of it. And instead of thinking, well, that's silly, I remember if you told me Gulliver's Travels at the age of 6 or 7, I would have known what you were referring to. And it wasn't because I was smarter, it's just that it was emphasized more. So, for example, I remember at the age of 6 or 7, I read the classics comic, Gulliver's Travels. It was considered of such immediate importance to society that a younger generation pick up on this set of canonical principles that they made a comic that young kids like me could have imbued at the time. There was also a comic, a cartoon strip made of Gulliver's Travels, because once again, it was felt this is such an important story. We want people to pick up on it from an early age. So we will, in a sense, dumb it down, introduce it to them at an early age, and then they'll pick up on its real meaning as they grow older. That is how you have continuity, right? But we don't do that any longer because these canonical texts no longer speak to the producers who made this cartoon nowadays or to young children. We just figure these are so off target, there is no point continuing with the messages that they propagate. You also have continuity when you insist that people read. Of course, if you're going to access these texts, you have to read. And then, of course, you study them on the university level. That too will guarantee that these things continue. So hit them when they're young with comic books, right, and cartoons, and then grab them with books when they're a slightly later age, and then finally give them the go at it full throttle when they're adults, and you will have them forever. Except, right, when you compare teenagers from the 1970s with teenagers today, right, they read significantly less, 8.4 minutes daily today, right, as opposed to 25 to 30 to 45 minutes daily back in the 70s, right? We're not reading to nearly the same degree. And what's true of teenagers is true of adults. We read significantly less today. That's a bit misleading. We read a great deal when it comes to work, contracts, and emails and the like. And we go on social media and we surf the web. But the idea of reading for pleasure, sitting down in privacy and reading a text, an older text, that is now off our radar screen, right? Off our radar screen. And it's been replaced, of course, by Facebook and Netflix and TV and so on and so forth. There are very good reasons why we're not reading. But the main point is that if we're not reading and we're looking at the topics of interest today, the cultural products of interest today, then of course we're not going to discover these treasures of the canon for ourselves. And it shows on the university level too. It's not just that we're not reading more, which would be one part of the equation. It turns out that when we do get to the university level, we don't really care much for the canon. So when you take a look at English degrees, you can see the figures there for yourself, right? In 1971, 8% of all BAs were English degrees, then it fell to 4%, then it fell to 2% in the year 2019. One can only imagine what it is today. In 2020, of all the BAs that were granted, or all the bachelor degrees that were awarded in the United States, 4% involved the humanities, classics, history, languages, right, comparative literature, and so on and so forth. 4%. People aren't interested in this any longer. They are not imbibing the canon as they did at an earlier stage. Right? It's a necessary aspect to any canon that you actually study it as an adult, and we're simply not doing that. And the effects are cascading ones. If you've got a family sitting down to supper, right, what are they going to talk about when they talk about things that are serious? And this is making the assumption that they do sit down to supper, right? Well, if mom and dad never study the humanities on the university level, and these texts aren't on their shelves, Junior is not going to hear this discussed around the supper table, and he's never going to be able to go to the bookshelf and actually track these old texts for himself either. This happened with me and what my parents were reading and what their parents were reading, but it stopped. It somehow stopped in my generation and on. Probably for very good reason, but it did stop. And when I say for good reason, well, think of it from today's typical citizen's perspective. Look at that woman on the right. Why should she have any appreciation for Tess of the Dubervilles? The story, this marvelous story by Thomas Hardy, is taking place in the country. She lives in the city. Tess is this milkmaid. She's a computer programmer. Tess is helpless. This woman makes a very good living. Tess is beholden to the will of the local aristocrat who rapes her and gets her pregnant. This woman, well, no one's going to do that to her, right? She works independently, and if anyone puts their hand on her, those people are going to get in a lot of trouble, right? And if she were to develop an unwanted pregnancy, she could take the morning after pill, or she could get an abortion. When she reads this story of Tess, which is so affecting if you can see it through 19th century eyes or early 20th century eyes, she's probably thinking, what's the big deal? This doesn't tell me anything whatsoever about what it is to be, female today, what it is to work today, what it is to be productive today, or it doesn't give me any view of what my own ambitions and my own life program should be. It is irrelevant. One does ask. I mean, if this is true of Tess of the Dubervilles, one really has to ask whether classics that have come onto the scene over the last 15 years, like Toni Morrison's Beloved, or Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun, or The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, whether these are going to last as long as classics like 1984, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and The Great Gatsby. Right? 1984 was published in 1948, and it's had a pretty good run of it. Still in high schools, people read this. I don't think they read For Whom the Bell Tolls so much, but they probably read The Great Gatsby. So these books have had a pretty good run of it, even though we see the steam is coming out, or the air is coming out of the tires, right? One truly wonders whether The Handmaid's Tale will be read for the next 20 years in classrooms, or whether the student from 20 years ago is going to be thinking, to tell you the truth, I just don't see the point of it. It doesn't mean anything to me, right? One really wonders whether Harry Potter, this extraordinary publishing sensation from 10 to 15 years back, whether it will have the lasting power of Lord of the Rings. For the last 10 years, I've always asked my students in grade 10, who are just the right age to read Harry Potter, how many of you read Harry Potter? 10, 15 years ago, everybody's hand went up. In recent days, maybe 2 or 3 hands. Already, it isn't quite, right, quite as reflective of how they see themselves as it was for their older siblings, fascinatingly. And this just raises the question, can we come up with a canon nowadays that has any lasting power whatsoever? If we think of any cultural product that is being produced, even as I speak, a television show, a movie, a poem, a novel, a song, can we actually say with any degree of confidence that this is going to last 50 years? I mean, it's not just going to be something that some people tune into, but 50 years from now, children will be able, everyone will be able to hum this music, everybody. I don't think so. I just don't think that's the case. Because once we got rid of these foundational canonical texts like the Homer and the Bible, it just affected the lifespan of every cultural product now. We are living in a world where we will essentially be canonless, or the canon that guides us is going to last just a couple of years rather than even the stretch of one generation. We're going to throw it out of our craft. We started throwing this other stuff out of our craft, right, some time ago. Now we're emptying the craft at an ever more rapid rate so that we can climb, to higher heights at an ever more rapid rate as well. Even in the case of classics, I'm arguing that I read classics, right, this ancient material, but I can't pretend for a moment that I read Greek and Latin in the same way that that gentleman in the right-hand corner did. That's Mr. Chapman, who first rendered it into English. Or the man on the right, that's Wolfe, who first argued that Homer was an oral poem, or like Milman Parry, right, who proved that it is an oral poem, or like Thucydides, the historian Thucydides, who read Homer with a fluency that I could never have achieved, and in an ancient context which I couldn't possibly replicate from my own modern perspective. Even when I read these classics, it was very different from the way in which modern people had read these classics, or ancient people had read these classics, or medievalists had read these classics. It's an interesting question. When we think of the young Englishman on the left and we compare him to his grandfather or great-grandfather on his right, can either one of them read Dr. No by Ian Fleming with the same set of eyes? The one gentleman lived through the Blitz and the Cold War and had this idea of what it was to be English. And this man here, he's not really thinking of what it is to be English. He's thinking of what it is to be modern. Can they look at a text as modern as Dr. No and see it with the same eyes, let alone read, Shakespeare with the same set of eyes, given the changed perspective of both these people? When you take a look at this young black girl on the left, can she read The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison? This extraordinary narrative of what it was like to live at the time of Jim Crow, how you are invisible to the white population. Can she read it and sense the pathos in this text in nearly the same way that her grandmother, who lived through Jim Crow, could? This young girl saw a black man sit in the White House office. She has a product. She is now, 30 years after the onset of the civil rights movement. She can decide whether she wants to go to Yale or Princeton if she has the right stuff to do so, and nothing will stand in her way, right? As opposed to her grandmother, who remembers a very different world. How can they see this text chronicling that older world with the same set of eyes? It's absolutely impossible. In fact, perhaps this young black girl or her child or her grandchild will look at The Invisible Man saying, it's all a fairy tale. It means nothing to me. Even though it describes the type of suffering that took place to my ancestors, it means very little to me. If the Orthodox gentleman on the left, right, if he could read the Bible in the same way as David on the right did, why would he need his Talmud? Why would he have to have this huge commentary to, that enables him to get to the intricacies of Torah, if he could read it with the exact same eyes as someone who is much closer to the creation of Torah? The fact is that in spite of his own orthodoxy and extraordinary dedication and faith, still this gentleman is at a loss to understand this text, which is so ancient, and therefore he sees it with a different set of eyes. than his precursors, even his 15th century precursor or 11th century precursor. He is living in this age, and that gives him a different perspective on this traditional text. We can go further. Is the Frenchman of today the same as the Frenchman of yesteryear? Here's a Frenchman from the 19th century. Would he recognize that this man, Zidane, of Algerian origin, and the idol of so many Frenchmen because he was just a phenomenal soccer player, would he have recognized this man as being French, as opposed to a modern day population of Frenchmen saying, when I grow up, I want to be just like him? It shows you how national identity can change so drastically. It is true of parties as well. Is the Republican Party of Reagan the same as the Republican Party of Lincoln and the same as the Republican Party of Trump? And the answer to that is decisively no. And the same would be true of the Democratic Party. Is the Democratic Party of a Stephen Douglas the same as the Democratic Party of a Woodrow Wilson or an FDR, and finally of Joe Biden? Again, these are so changed that they're almost unrecognizable. Right? The person voting for the Democratic Party today would never vote for the Democratic Party of Stephen Douglas, or perhaps even Woodrow Wilson. Is a man today, getting back to this idea of manliness, is a man today, an American male today, right, the same as his father or grandfather? When we see this male behavior as modeled by Gregory Peck here in The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, is that manliness in any way compatible with the manliness that we see in the case of a Brad Pitt? And that's a foundational question. Just think of it. We're not talking about something incidental, the way they dress. We're talking about something that dictates how they carry themselves through the whole of their lives. And that quantity too has changed because the texts have changed, because the technology has changed, and so on and so forth. Is a black man back from the 50s the same as a black man today? Is their idea of how you carry yourself forward as an African American in any way similar to each other? Of course, there are commonalities, but the one model is very, very different from the other, as it would be for someone of Asian origin, as it would be for a modern day Turk, right? 1950s on the right, modern day Turk, on the left. That Turk probably has more in common with someone my son's age here in Canada than he does with the population that gave rise to him 2 generations earlier, because there has been so much baggage thrown out of his personal Saturn V. In other words, our Saturn V continues to climb. We continue to jettison these different stages. We continue to throw our baggage out so that we can continue our voyage. And this means a sense of loss for everybody. Everybody is on something of a meteoric collision course with the loss of identity. It is comprehensive if you're living in the modern world. But, of course, with losses come enormous gains. And as significant as the losses have been, to some degree, anyone modern is put in this deeply paradoxical condition where they have chosen to lose, and at the same time, they wouldn't want to go back. They wouldn't want to trade their modern gains for the losses that they now see drifting about in outer space. So once again, I think we can agree that we have sustained very significant losses. When we get together next time, I would like to challenge your concept of what we mean by assimilation.